This is the story of how America's most decorated World War II soldier died under circumstances that have raised questions for over 50 years. Audie Murphy survived some of the deadliest combat in military history, only to die in a plane crash in 1971 that officially was ruled pilot error, but the details surrounding that crash have never fully added up. Audie Leon Murphy was born on June 20, 1925 in Kingston, Texas, and he came from nothing. His family was dirt poor sharecroppers struggling through the Depression, and by the time he was a teenager, his father had abandoned them and his mother had died. Murphy stood just 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed barely 110 pounds when he tried to enlist after Pearl Harbor, and the Marines rejected him for being too small. The Navy turned him down. The paratroopers wouldn't take him either. Finally, the Army let him in, and that decision changed military history. What Murphy did in World War II sounds impossible, even when you know it's documented. He landed in Sicily in 1943 when he was just 18 years old, fought through Italy and France, and earned every major combat award the United States military could give. The numbers are staggering. 33 awards and decorations, including the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, the Legion of Merit, and 2 Bronze Stars with Valor devices, 2 Purple Hearts for being wounded in action. He killed over 240 enemy soldiers, a number that military historians have verified through after-action reports and eyewitness accounts. The action that earned him the Medal of Honor happened on January 26, 1945, near the French village of Holzwehr. German forces launched a major counterattack with 6 tanks and waves of infantry, and Murphy's company was about to be overrun. He ordered his men to fall back to defensive positions, then climbed onto a burning tank destroyer that could explode at any moment and used its .50 caliber machine gun to hold off the entire German advance by himself. For an hour he stood there alone, exposed to enemy fire, wounded in the leg, calling in artillery strikes on his own position because the Germans had gotten that close. When he finally ran out of ammunition and the Germans pulled back, he had personally killed or wounded 50 enemy soldiers and turned the entire battle. He was 19 years old. Murphy came home in 1945 as the most decorated soldier America had ever produced, and that's when his real problems started. The war didn't end for him just because the shooting stopped. He couldn't sleep without a loaded pistol under his pillow. Nightmares woke him up screaming. Loud noises sent him diving for cover. He became addicted to prescription sleeping pills because that was the only way he could get any rest. And when he realized the pills were destroying him, he locked himself in a motel room for a week to quit cold turkey. The withdrawal nearly killed him, but he made it through. And then he did something that almost no combat veteran of that era ever did. He talked about it publicly. In the late 1940s and through the 1950s and 60s, what we now call PTSD was called battle fatigue or shell shock. And admitting you had it meant you were weak. Real men didn't break down. Real soldiers didn't need help. Murphy didn't care what people thought. He went on television and gave interviews to newspapers and told anyone who would listen that combat changes you in ways that never heal, that thousands of veterans were suffering in silence, and that the government owed them real treatment and support. He testified before Congress. He pushed for better funding for veterans' hospitals. He became one of the first major public figures in America to say out loud that psychological wounds from war are just as real as physical ones. Hollywood had noticed Murphy during the war because of all the publicity around his Medal of Honor, and when he came back, they offered him a chance to act. He appeared in his first film in 1948, and over the next 20 years he made 44 movies. Most of them were westerns, the kind of low-budget films that played in small-town theaters and drive-ins. He was never a major star like John Wayne or Jimmy Stewart, but he worked steadily, and in 1955 he did something unusual. He starred as himself in To Hell and Back, a film adaptation of his own autobiography, where he recreated his war experiences on camera. The movie became Universal Pictures' highest-grossing film up to that point, and Murphy had to live through all of it again, performing scenes from the worst moments of his life for an audience. What nobody understood at the time was that Murphy was using his platform to investigate something he'd discovered about how the government was treating veterans. During the Korean War and into the Vietnam era, Murphy started hearing stories from other veterans about experimental treatments at VA hospitals, programs that didn't make sense, and money that was supposed to go to veteran care but seemed to disappear. He was particularly focused on how the Veterans Administration was handling psychological trauma cases, and he started asking questions that made people in Washington uncomfortable. The United States government was running programs during this period that sound like conspiracy theories until you read the declassified documents. MK Ultra was real. It ran from 1953 to 1973 under CIA direction, and its purpose was to develop mind control and interrogation techniques using LSD and other drugs. The Church Committee investigation in 1975 exposed the program after CIA Director Richard Helms ordered most of the files destroyed in 1973. But what survived showed that the CIA had conducted experiments on American citizens without their knowledge or consent. Some of those experiments happened at veterans' hospitals. Some of the test subjects were veterans seeking treatment for combat trauma. Whether Murphy had uncovered specific information about MK Ultra or related programs is something we can't verify from public records. But what we know for certain is that he was advocating loudly for better oversight of how veterans were being treated and where government money was going. He had the combination of things that make someone dangerous to people who want to keep secrets. He was famous enough that people listened to him, he was credible because of his military record, and he wasn't backing down. On May 28, 1971, Murphy boarded a twin-engine Aero Commander 680 for a flight from Atlanta to Martinsville, Virginia. He was traveling to check on a business investment, something he needed to do because his finances were a mess. Hollywood work had dried up by the late 1960s. He'd made some bad investments, and he was struggling with debt. 5 other people were on that plane with him, including the pilot. They flew into a storm system over southwestern Virginia with poor visibility and heavy fog. At approximately 3 p.m., the aircraft crashed into Brush Mountain near Catawba, about 20 miles west of Roanoke. The impact destroyed the plane completely, killing everyone on board instantly. Local authorities and investigators spent days searching the heavily wooded mountainside for wreckage and remains. The National Transportation Safety Board investigated the crash and issued their official finding pilot error due to flying into the mountain in conditions of poor visibility. The pilot had continued flying in weather that should have grounded the aircraft or forced him to navigate around the storm system. The conclusion was that Murphy died because someone made a bad decision about whether it was safe to fly that day. Nothing more complicated than that. That official explanation is where the questions begin, not where they end. The NTSB report was straightforward, but several aspects of the crash have never been fully explained in public records. Witnesses who arrived at the crash site reported that significant pieces of the aircraft seemed to be missing, not destroyed, but absent entirely, as though parts had separated from the plane before impact. The pilot's background included some connections to government contract work, though the specifics of that work have never been detailed in accessible records. Murphy's family and some of his close friends maintained for years afterward that he had been increasingly concerned about his safety in the months before the crash, though no contemporaneous documentation of those concerns has been made public. None of this proves sabotage, and that needs to be stated clearly. Missing aircraft components could have been scattered across a wider debris field than searchers initially covered. Pilots with government contract experience were common in that era, especially military pilots. Concerns about safety could have been related to Murphy's financial stress and his awareness that people he'd angered in Washington had long memories. But the fact that questions can be answered with plausible explanations doesn't mean those explanations are proven. Murphy's son, Terry Michael Murphy, spent years trying to get access to additional information about the crash through Freedom of Information Act requests, and by speaking with investigators and witnesses. Some of those requests resulted in heavily redacted documents where entire pages were blacked out, and the justification given was national security. Why a routine aviation accident investigation would contain information classified for national security reasons decades after the fact is a question that has never been answered satisfactorily. The historical context matters here because we're not talking about a normal period in American history. This was 1971, at the height of the Vietnam War, when trust in government institutions was collapsing. The Pentagon Papers had just been leaked, revealing that the Department of Defense had lied to the public and Congress for years about the war. The CIA's activities in Southeast Asia and Latin America were starting to become public knowledge. Watergate was about to explode, and programs like MK-Ultra, which the government would spend the next several years trying to keep hidden before being forced to admit their existence, were still active. Murphy had survived 3 years of continuous frontline combat in World War II, some of the most intense fighting the American military had ever experienced. He'd been wounded multiple times. He'd charged German machine gun positions alone. He'd held off an entire enemy company by himself while standing on a burning vehicle. The idea that this man who had survived all of that would die because a pilot made a poor decision about flying in bad weather struck many people at the time as unlikely, not impossible, but unlikely. Aviation accidents happen, even to experienced pilots, and statistically, most plane crashes result from human error or mechanical failure rather than foul play. Fog and poor visibility in mountainous terrain create exactly the conditions where fatal mistakes get made. But aviation accidents also provide cover for other things, and the United States government's track record during this period for transparency and honesty about its own activities was not good. What we can verify is that Audie Murphy died on May 28, 1971 in a plane crash officially attributed to pilot error. We can verify that he had been advocating for veterans and asking uncomfortable questions about government programs. We can verify that programs like MK-Ultra existed and that the CIA was conducting experiments on veterans during the same period Murphy was raising concerns. We can verify that some documentation related to the crash investigation remains classified or heavily redacted. We can verify that Murphy's family pursued answers for decades and felt those answers were being withheld. What we cannot verify from publicly available evidence is that the crash was anything other than what the NTSB concluded. The absence of proof for sabotage is not the same thing as proof that sabotage didn't occur, but it does mean that any claim of conspiracy requires acknowledging it's built on circumstantial evidence and pattern recognition rather than documentation. Murphy is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and his grave remains one of the most visited sites there, second only to President Kennedy's memorial. People still leave medals and flags and notes thanking him for his service. His advocacy for PTSD awareness and veteran mental health treatment was decades ahead of its time. The term PTSD didn't even exist in official psychiatric diagnosis until 1980, 9 years after his death, when the American Psychiatric Association finally added it to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Everything Murphy had been saying about combat trauma turned out to be correct, and the treatments he'd been demanding eventually became standard care. The mystery of what happened on Brush Mountain that day in 1971 hasn't been solved in the sense that we have definitive proof one way or another. What has been solved is that the official explanation leaves enough questions unanswered, that doubt persists, and whether that doubt is justified or simply the result of pattern seeking and tragedy depends on how much you trust institutions that have admitted to lying about other things during the same period. Audie Murphy deserved better than to die at 45 years old in a plane crash under any circumstances. Whether he died because of bad weather and a pilot's poor judgment, or because someone wanted him silenced before he could expose something the government wanted hidden, the result is the same. America lost someone who had given everything in combat and then spent his remaining years trying to help other veterans who were suffering the same wounds he carried. The fact that we're still asking questions about his death 50 years later is a testament to how much he mattered and how incomplete the official story feels to anyone who examines it closely. What's not in question is what kind of man Audie Murphy was. He was 5'5" and 110 pounds when the Army finally agreed to take him, and he became the most lethal soldier in American military history. He came home broken by what he'd seen and done, and instead of hiding it, he told the truth about it when nobody else would. He used his fame to fight for veterans who had no voice and no advocate. He asked questions that powerful people didn't want asked, and he didn't stop asking them because it made him uncomfortable or unpopular. Then he got on a plane on May 28, 1971, and he never came home. The official explanation is that it was an accident, pilot error and bad weather, nothing more. The unanswered questions and pattern of classified documents and missing evidence suggests that maybe there's more to the story than that, but without proof, it remains speculation. What isn't speculation is that Audie Murphy deserved answers, his family deserved answers, and the veterans he fought for deserved answers. Whether we'll ever get those answers depends on whether the documents that are still classified ever see daylight. And given how long it's been, that seems increasingly unlikely. The mystery isn't solved. It's just old enough now that most of the people who could provide answers are gone, and the institutions that might have them have had more than 50 years to decide that some questions are better left unanswered. Whether you believe that's because there's nothing to hide or because there's something they can't afford to reveal tells you more about your view of government accountability than it does about what actually happened to Audie Murphy. What we know for certain is this: the man who survived hell came home and tried to help others who'd been there with him, and when he died, the circumstances were suspicious enough that people are still arguing about them decades later. That's not the ending anyone would have written for America's most decorated soldier, but it's the one we got, and the fact that it doesn't feel right doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it incomplete,